Greetings everyone, I'm Detective STARBORN, and I'm glad to see you on my YouTube channel. Please be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss out on new and interesting videos. Thank you and enjoy watching. A girl and her younger brother left school and headed home, after which her entire family mysteriously disappeared. The police began their search, not suspecting they were about to uncover what might be the strangest and most disturbing case, with details that were not only shocking, but also bewildering. Sarah Maynard was born on April 1, 1997 in the small American city of Mount Vernon, Ohio. 2 years later, her parents had a son named Cody, but ultimately the couple decided to divorce. Their father continued to see the children regularly, and for some time they even lived on the same street. However, he later married another woman. They had a child together, and the family decided to move to another state. Sarah's mom, Tina, started a relationship with a man named Greg. They moved from an apartment to a private house located in the suburbs of Mount Vernon. It was a quiet residential area situated around a large scenic lake. By 2010, when Sarah was 13, her father moved back to their city with his family, which allowed him to see his children regularly again. Around the same time, Tina started thinking about moving back to Mount Vernon to be closer to work. She began casually looking at various apartment options, and her best friend and neighbor Stephanie helped her with this. The woman lived 2 houses away from Tina, and their families had become friends after moving in. Tina worked at a restaurant on the outskirts of Mount Vernon, and on November 10, 2010, she was scheduled to work the evening shift. However, she never showed up there. The restaurant manager immediately suspected something was wrong. She knew Tina well, and she had never missed her shift before, especially without notice. The woman needed to support 2 children, and finding a good job in their small town was quite difficult. After waiting for some time, the manager decided to call the police and ask them to check if Tina was all right. Officers were sent to her house, where they knocked on the door but received no answer. The house was dark and silent. The police thought no one was home and left. The next day, Tina again didn't show up for work. Her manager tried calling both her home and mobile phones, but there was no answer anywhere. She even found Tina's emergency backup contact, which was her friend Stephanie's number, but she wasn't answering calls either. Thinking something bad might have happened to Tina, the manager decided to drive to her house. No one answered when she knocked on the door, but she wasn't about to give up. She walked around the house, saw a slightly open window, and climbed inside. As soon as she entered the house, a horrifying sight greeted her. The rooms were covered in blood, and the woman immediately jumped back outside. She called the police, who told her to stay away from the house. When officers broke down the door, they were immediately met with pools of blood. They started right at the thresholds, extending into the living room, bathroom, and other rooms. However, there wasn't a single body in the house. The police also noticed that there was something else on the pools of blood. They suspected someone had poured motor oil over the floors after the crime. After examining the crime scene, investigators put forward a preliminary theory of what happened. There was a grocery bag by the entrance, and bloody tracks also started near the door. This could indicate that one of the residents entered the house with groceries, where the perpetrator was already waiting. Immediately after this, he attacked his victim and, judging by the amount of blood, killed them. The grocery bag also helped police establish an approximate time of the incident. Most likely, it was Tina who had gone to the store, and the receipt showed exactly 12 o'clock on November 10th. During the house inspection, investigators discovered that the garage door was partially raised. Apparently, this was how the perpetrator had entered the house. Additionally, there was blood inside the garage, and Tina's pickup truck was missing. Meanwhile, Tina's manager told them she had tried to reach her friend, but she wasn't answering either. Given that Stephanie lived just a few meters away from this house, officers went there and discovered that the woman had also been missing since the previous day, though her relatives hadn't been particularly concerned about it for some reason. Furthermore, they contacted the school where Sarah and Cody attended. They were told that yesterday the children were present for all their classes, but today they weren't at school. Based on the amount of blood in the house, detectives understood that it clearly couldn't have belonged to just one person. Thus, they feared that the unknown perpetrator had killed Tina, then her 2 children when they returned from school, and the neighbor who might have stopped by to visit her friend at that moment. Notably, investigators also noticed a bloody shoe print on the floor, pointing toward the door. Its size matched Sarah's footwear, and the police hoped the girl might be alive. Apparently, the person who left the print had exited the house after whatever had happened there. Therefore, there remained hope of finding Sarah alive. Crime scene investigators visually identified 3 different groups of blood stains and smears that could have belonged to different people. All of them led to the bathroom where the murder most likely took place. Given that there were no bodies in the house and Tina's car was missing, police assumed that the perpetrator had loaded them into it and driven away in the woman's vehicle. Detectives put out an APB on the car and began searching for all 4 possible victims. Parallel to this, they started checking the most obvious suspects, Tina's boyfriend and her ex-husband. Greg said he was at work at the time. The man worked at a warehouse located almost 60 miles from home, so he had to get up early and drive there. Investigators contacted his management and were able to confirm that the man was indeed at the warehouse, after which he stayed overnight at a friend's place near work. And given the distance, he physically couldn't have come and committed this murder. They also discovered that his relationship with Tina was going through a rough patch. Greg said they were planning to separate in the very near future. Sarah and Cody's father also stated that he had nothing to do with what happened. He learned about the situation from the police and appeared genuinely concerned for his children. Meanwhile, crime scene investigators were examining the house, hoping to find any leads. While taking blood samples from the garage, something caught their attention. There was a bag full of various cleaning supplies and garbage bags, and inside was also a tarp. At first glance, it might have seemed that these items had nothing to do with what happened and could have been stored in the garage. But the bag also contained several bottles of motor oil, and as we remember, all the blood stains in the house were covered with this substance. Investigators suspected that these items might have actually been brought by the perpetrator. There was no receipt in the bag, but it had the name Walmart on it, and there was only one such store in their city. They went there and requested all surveillance camera footage from the previous day, hoping to find the perpetrator by matching the purchased items with what was found in the house. While they waited for the recordings, something interesting happened. The next day, patrol officers found Tina's pickup truck a few miles from her home, abandoned on the side of the road. To the detective's surprise, there were no traces of blood inside. Given how much blood was in the house and that the perpetrator had likely transported the bodies in Tina's vehicle, this seemed strange. There were no other clues there, so the police could only hope for the surveillance footage from Walmart. They began reviewing it and soon noticed a man who was buying the same items that were found in the garage. He appeared completely calm and relaxed, but detectives believed they had found their perpetrator. Tracking him through street cameras, police saw that he got into a car and drove away. It wasn't Tina's pickup, but rather a Toyota Yaris. The recording quality didn't allow them to make out the license plate, so investigators had to study a list of all vehicles of this model registered in their county. This database also contained driver's licenses with their owners' photographs, and soon the police noticed a similar-looking person. In his license photo, he was wearing the same shirt as in the Walmart surveillance footage. This person was 30-year-old Matthew Hoffman. His parents had a house near the same lake where Tina lived with her children. He also had a criminal history, primarily being arrested for burglary, and in 2001, he was sentenced to 6 years in prison for arson. Notably, at that time, he fled the scene in the car belonging to the homeowner whose house he had burned. Matthew lived in Mount Vernon, 20 minutes away from Tina's house. Detectives requested a warrant, and on November 14th, 3 days after the investigation began, a SWAT team stormed his house. They expected to see almost anything there, but none of the police officers could believe their eyes. The entire house was covered in fallen tree leaves. They lay in piles half a meter high in every room. In addition to this, bags stuffed with leaves stood along the walls up to the ceiling, even in the bathroom. Matthew was home, and they immediately arrested him. The man asked what was happening, to which one of the officers responded something like, "As if you don't know." And after that, Matthew fell silent. The detectives were slightly bewildered, as all of them were seeing something like this for the first time in their lives. Their first thought was that Matthew had piled these leaves in the house to cover up the bodies of his victims. The situation was complicated by the fact that the leaves were wet and stuck together. Plus, the detectives needed to exercise caution in case the suspect might have booby-trapped these piles. Eventually, they decided to take thin sticks and carefully probe the leaves. This led nowhere. It turned out there was nothing under all the piles. The police searched both floors, then went down to the basement. On the floor, they immediately saw another pile of leaves. But when they shined their flashlights further, the investigators were met with another unexpected turn. On these leaves, rags were laid out forming a kind of bed, and on it was Sarah. The girl was alive, and her life wasn't in danger. Sarah was immediately taken to the hospital for examination, while Matthew was taken in for questioning. Despite finding the missing girl in his basement, the man refused to acknowledge his guilt or tell them where Tina, Stephanie, and Cody were. More precisely, Matthew barely answered any questions. He said a few words at the beginning of the interrogation, then simply stared silently at the detective. At one point, he began making gestures, pointing to his heart. When the detective asked, "Are you trying to say your heart is broken?" the man nodded, but then he continued to remain silent. Meanwhile, crime scene investigators continued to search every inch of his house. But there were neither the missing people themselves nor any hints about where they might be. In the end, investigators were left hoping for only one thing: Sarah's testimony. They went to her at the hospital and asked what had happened that day. Sarah told them that on November 10th, she and Cody returned from school on the bus. Upon entering the house, they immediately noticed blood near the front door. The girl called out for her mom, but instead of her, an unknown man ran out at them from the adjacent room. Sarah dodged him and rushed to her bedroom, slamming the door shut. Cody ran toward the exit, but the girl didn't see if he managed to leave the house. She started looking for her cell phone and with trembling hands tried to dial 911, but she couldn't manage it. The perpetrator kicked down the door and lunged at her with a knife. While the girl tried to fight him off, he cut her finger, and Sarah thought the man would kill her. But instead, the perpetrator cut the cord from a fan and tied her hands with it. Then he gagged her mouth with some cloth, blindfolded her, and took her down to the basement. Sometime later, he returned and moved her to the kitchen. Sarah couldn't see what was happening and had to rely only on her hearing. Over the course of several hours, the perpetrator rummaged through various things in the kitchen, ran water, and frequently flushed the toilet. When it got dark outside, he turned on lights everywhere and continued moving around the house. Later, the man approached Sarah, told her not to try to resist, and carried her to the garage, where he placed her in her mother's car. After covering her with a blanket, he left and didn't return until near nighttime. The man got behind the wheel and drove somewhere. After some time, he stopped, told Sarah not to try to escape, and left. The girl attempted to remove the blindfold from her face, but because of her bound hands, she only managed to do so partially. Nevertheless, she immediately recognized where the perpetrator had taken her. It was the sports complex with baseball fields where her younger brother used to practice. This place was approximately half a mile from their house. At that moment, the perpetrator suddenly returned, flung open the door, and began shouting at her. He repositioned the blindfold and said that if she tried to remove it again, he would kill her. Then he left again and returned about an hour later in a different car, transferred Sarah into it, and drove her somewhere else. The man stopped near some house, told her not to scream, and carried her inside. There, he removed her blindfold, and Sarah could look around for the first time. The perpetrator had brought her to a bathroom and something strange immediately caught the girl's eye. The walls were covered with drawings of people, animals, and inexplicable creatures. The man left Sarah tied up in the bathroom and departed. The girl didn't know what he planned to do with her or what he had already done to her mother and brother. In their house, she hadn't seen anything except blood, but she was beginning to suspect that he had killed them. The perpetrator returned many hours later and led Sarah out of the bathroom. The girl immediately noticed that the entire house was filled with bags of leaves, and the floors of almost all rooms were covered with them. While Sarah was alone, she decided that her best option would be to try to talk to the perpetrator and gain his trust. She asked why he had so many leaves, to which the man replied, "I use them to keep the house warm." The girl asked him several more questions, after which she decided to ask if he had killed her mother and brother. The perpetrator answered, "No." Sarah didn't believe him, but was afraid to accept the fact that her relatives might be dead. She said she was hungry, to which the man responded, "I have some dead squirrels in the refrigerator. Would you like me to cook them for you?" Sarah, naturally, refused, and then he made her cereal. However, the milk had gone sour, but by that point, the girl hadn't eaten for almost 24 hours and didn't have much choice. After this, the man led her to the basement, where there was something like a bed. He tied her up again and left her there. Since then, she spent several days there. The perpetrator told her that during his absence, his partner would be watching the house, so she shouldn't try to escape. The man didn't give her any food, and the girl began suffering from hunger. Despite this, she wouldn't under any circumstances eat the squirrels that the man offered to cook. One day, the perpetrator came down to the girl and subjected her to assault, leaving Sarah in a shocked and exhausted state. She didn't know how much time had passed since her kidnapping and increasingly believed she wouldn't make it out of this house alive. One day, Sarah suddenly heard shouting and noise. At first, the girl was frightened, thinking the perpetrator had brought some partners who might also harm her, but soon the SWAT team burst into the basement and Sarah realized she was saved. The girl immediately shocked all the police officers with her first words. She said she urgently needed to get to school. Later, Sarah explained that at that moment she couldn't think rationally, and it seemed to her that she would be in very serious trouble for missing so many classes. Thus, after Sarah's rescue and Matthew's arrest, the detectives had just one main task remaining: to determine the whereabouts of Tina, Stephanie, and Cody. Despite Matthew continuing to remain silent, the detective didn't interrupt the interrogation. In total, the interrogation continued for about 9 hours, and toward the end, the local prosecutor offered him a deal. He offered to take the death penalty off the table if Matthew would tell them everything, and the man agreed. But there was a catch. He set counter conditions and asked the officers to stage an escape attempt, during which they would shoot him. Naturally, the authorities couldn't agree to something like this, so they had to continue their searches, which had been ongoing since the very first day. This case had initially captured the attention of their small town, and local residents tried to help the police in their search. After news of Sarah's rescue spread through the county, the number of volunteers grew significantly to nearly 400 people. But despite all their efforts, they couldn't locate the 3 missing people. This continued for 2 days after Sarah's discovery, until Matthew's attorney informed investigators that his client wanted to confess to everything. Matthew wrote a letter in which he revealed what had happened. According to his account, initially he had simply planned to rob the house, but everything went off plan. On November 9th, closer to night, he parked his car several kilometers from the location and walked there on foot. Matthew went into the woods opposite Sarah's house, laid out a sleeping bag, had a snack, and began watching. Around 3 o'clock in the morning, he saw a car leave the house. It was Greg, who was heading to work. The next morning, when Sarah and Cody had left for school and Tina went shopping, Matthew began executing his plan. He broke into the house through the broken garage door. While he was inside, Tina returned home and entered the kitchen with her groceries. Matthew immediately attacked her with a knife and stabbed the woman several times. At that same moment, Stephanie walked into the house through the open door and immediately saw everything happening. Matthew rushed at her and dragged her into Sarah's bedroom, where he killed her. Then the man returned to Tina and inflicted multiple knife wounds from which she died. After this, the man carried the bodies to the bathroom, where he dismembered them. Matthew put the remains in garbage bags, then found motor oil in the house and began pouring it on all the blood stains throughout the house. After what he had done, he planned to burn down the house, hoping the fire would destroy all evidence. While he was doing all this, Sarah and Cody entered the house. The man rushed toward them, and while the girl managed to escape to the bedroom, her brother headed toward the front door. However, Matthew caught up with him and struck him in the head with the knife, then inflicted several more wounds to make sure he was definitely dead. Then he entered Sarah's bedroom and initially wanted to kill her too, but according to Matthew, something stopped him and he decided to keep her alive. Over the next several hours, he continued dismembering the bodies, placing remains in bags, and pouring motor oil over the bloodstains. Then he moved Sarah to her mother's car, placing those bags next to the girl. Then he switched to his own car, brought Sarah to his house, and began thinking about what to do next. Matthew decided to drive to Walmart to buy more motor oil and various cleaning supplies. He also brought along climbing equipment he had left over from when he worked as a tree trimmer. After the store, Matthew drove to where he had left Tina's car, got into it, and drove to a remote park where he knew a suitable place to hide the bags with remains. After finishing, he drove back to Tina's house. The man carried the bag with purchased items into the garage and wanted to switch to the second car that was near the house, but here he encountered a problem. There was something wrong with the vehicle. It was making strange noises. Matthew realized that this would only draw attention to himself and abandoned this idea. He left Tina's car in the parking lot at the entrance to the park on the edge of town, abandoned it there, and walked several kilometers to his Toyota. In it, he returned home and didn't go anywhere else that day. He planned to drive back to Tina's house with several cans of gasoline and set it on fire, but he was too tired. The next morning, he prepared to carry out his plan and drove to the parking lot where he had previously left Tina's car. But before he could get into it, a police car drove past the parking lot. At this point, the blood in Tina's house hadn't yet been discovered, but the patrol officer knew they had received a request to check on Tina's whereabouts. He also knew that yesterday his colleague had approached her house and seen the same pickup truck that he now saw in the parking lot. The patrol officer was surprised, and then he noticed a second vehicle, a light-colored Toyota with a man behind the wheel. He approached Matthew, asked for identification, and questioned what he was doing there. The man replied that he was waiting for his girlfriend Sarah, and the police officer saw nothing suspicious in his behavior. He drove away, not suspecting that just a few hours later they would be confronting the crimes of this very man. Matthew returned home and burned some items in the backyard that could have served as evidence. He slept for several hours and around midnight prepared to drive once again to Sarah's house. He had left some of his belongings in the woods opposite the house and was worried that police might find them. But by that time, the house was already cordoned off and dozens of police officers were present. Matthew realized he could no longer set fire to the house, nor could he retrieve his belongings from the woods unnoticed. He sat in the trees on the other side of the house for several hours watching the police before deciding to return home. Since then, he had barely left his residence. The man remained at home where he assaulted Sarah, but eventually police tracked him down and rescued the girl. Detectives realized that Tina, Stephanie, and Cody had been dead this entire time. And in his written confession, Matthew finally told them the location where he had hidden the bags with remains. He had climbed a large tree in a remote part of the park using his equipment. The trunk of this tree was hollow inside, leaving enough space to place the bags there. Officers arrived at the location and discovered the remains inside the tree after cutting a hole in the trunk. After this, Matthew was charged with triple homicide, and the man didn't deny his guilt. Given that he had revealed the location of the remains, it was decided to take the death penalty off the table. Investigators understood that without his confession, they would never have been able to find them, and the relatives wouldn't have been able to bury their loved ones. Nevertheless, detectives strongly doubted certain aspects of his confession. Specifically, that it all began as a simple attempted burglary. Over several days, Matthew committed so many atrocities and calculated steps that the police simply didn't believe his words. It seemed far more likely that Matthew might have initially planned to kidnap Sarah. His mother's house was literally around the corner, and he could have seen the girl multiple times. Moreover, just a few days before the incident, he had bought a hunting knife, which is completely unnecessary for a burglary. However, whether he planned to kill Sarah's relatives in the process remains unclear. Many of Matthew's actions defied ordinary logic. Despite being found competent to stand trial, it was obvious that the man had serious mental health issues. This was most clearly evidenced by the leaves in his house. Psychologists concluded that, most likely, the man had an intimate attraction to trees. This is an extremely rare but nonetheless existing disorder. He had also worked as a tree trimmer, and before that, even as an adult, he constantly climbed trees, causing bewilderment among neighbors. Those who knew him before the murders recalled that at some point in his life, the man began catching and grilling squirrels, after which he would eat them. Despite all this, he seemed harmless to neighbors, and they even allowed their children to play with him in his yard. Matthew would climb trees with them, offer them food, and even watch movies with them. His behavior began to change drastically several months before kidnapping Sarah. He lost his tree trimming job, and for a rather strange reason. His boss fired him because Matthew not only exaggerated his qualifications, but also severely frightened him with his creepy behavior. After this, during an argument with his girlfriend, he suddenly began choking her. She immediately left him, and Matthew remained alone. Left without work, he not only had no money for living expenses, but also for paying $2 million in fines for his previous crime. 10 years before the incident, he had burglarized an apartment in a residential complex in Colorado, after which he set it on fire. The fire damaged not only this building, but several nearby structures as well. Fortunately, none of the residents were harmed, but Matthew was sentenced to 3 years in prison and an enormous fine that he was unable to pay. During the court proceedings for Sarah's kidnapping and the triple murder, Matthew again admitted his guilt, so the trial concluded fairly quickly. The man's attorney delivered a message from the perpetrator, who sat nearby and for some reason chose not to deliver this speech himself. The attorney said that everything that happened was the result of a failed burglary attempt, and his client had no intentions of kidnapping anyone. However, even if this were true, no leniency was forthcoming for the man. He received a life sentence without the possibility of parole and was sent to serve it in a maximum security prison. Notably, Sarah also wrote a message to the killer and wanted to read it in court, but everyone concluded that this might further traumatize the girl, so the prosecutor read the message instead. In it, Sarah said that the perpetrator had ruined her life by taking away her mother and brother. She also noted that Stephanie was a wonderful person and didn't deserve what Matthew did to her. In the end, she added that she was no longer afraid of him and thanked all the police officers who saved her. While in prison, Matthew repeatedly violated rules and complained that he was having panic attacks. Throughout this time, he never spoke a word about his crimes. As for Sarah, after being discharged from the hospital, she went to live with her father and his wife. Unfortunately, her trials didn't end after Matthew's trial. When she returned to school, some children laughed and bullied her. Despite this, she found the strength to move forward. Together with her father, they wrote a book about what happened and gave numerous interviews where the girl explained that anyone can survive even such a terrible tragedy as what happened to her. Since then, Sarah's father slept in the living room, keeping a loaded gun with him. He explained this by saying he had to protect his family and never allow something like this to happen again. But 3 years later, when Sarah was 16, everyone was shocked by unexpected news. The girl's father and his wife were arrested for subjecting her to physical abuse. Her father had hit her, and 5 days later, her stepmother pushed her down the stairs. During the proceedings, Sarah decided to drop the charges so they avoided punishment. Since then, she has led a private life, only rarely appearing on television. In 2019, another kidnapping survivor, Elizabeth Smart, brought together 6 women, including Sarah, who had survived similar experiences. During this conversation, they discussed how to find the strength to move forward, drawing from their own examples. Thank you for watching this video, and please don't forget to subscribe to my channel. I look forward to your comments on this situation. That was Detective STARBORN. See you soon.